I've spoken before in a previous video about early steel shafted clubs, but I still think that this is a very neglected area, and it will be worthwhile trying to highlight the collectability of these clubs again, because some of the designs are just beautiful to look at. So some of this video will go over some ground covered in the previous video, but then I'll look in detail at some early steel shafted clubs and the innovations that came with them. This is quite a long video, and I realise that for a lot of people it might be too long. So here are some time checks in case you want to skip ahead to specific parts of the video rather than watching the whole thing through. Before we look at any history or examples of clubs, it will be worthwhile considering the standing of early steel shafted golf clubs amongst collectors. For far too long they've been considered the poor relation to hickory and classic clubs. Amongst hickory enthusiasts, they might be seen as an unwelcome usurper, ending the reign of the well-collected and respected hickory dynasty. So they're almost regarded with scorn and not therefore considered as worth collecting by most hickory enthusiasts. The era of classic clubs is generally regarded as encompassing the 1950s through to the 1980s. While there are many classic collectors, they don't generally consider pre-war clubs as worthy of interest, and so early steel shafted clubs fall between these two established groups, the hickory collectors and the classic collectors. I hope to convince you in this short talk that early steel shafted clubs are actually a fascinating and rewarding area for collecting. The first recorded steel shaft was created by Thomas Horsburgh, a member of the Babberton Golf Club near Edinburgh. Horsburgh was a blacksmith by trade and made himself a set of steel shafted clubs. He was granted a patent in 1894, which included a version with a single shaft onto which a variety of heads could be screwed. The player would carry the one shaft and a bag of heads. I can't imagine why that idea didn't catch on. But perhaps the largest obstacle was the weight of the shafts, as, having only a blacksmith's tools, they were solid steel rather than tubular. Interest in the shafts was minimal, and Horsburgh allowed his patent to lapse, although it appears that he reapplied for it in 1930 when steel shafts were becoming popular, as evidenced by this patent dated 1930. A stepped tubular shaft was patented in America in 1910, and British company Accles and Pollock was granted a patent for a tapered seamless shaft in 1913, but it was banned by the R&A. The continued growth of golf as a participation sport, both in the UK and America, meant that by the mid to late 1920s, the availability of top quality hickory wood for making shafts was becoming an issue, and there were rumours that the market was being flooded by substandard material. Steel shafts were improving and pressure was being put onto the ruling bodies. In 1923, the USGA had barred their use in official play, but in early 1924, the USGA approved steel shafts. However, the R&A continued to resist. In 1923, the American Fork and Hoe Company began manufacturing steel golf shafts, and in 1928 patented a step-down process which became known as True Temper. In 1949, the company changed its name from American Fork and Hoe to True Temper. Back in the UK, in June 1929, Sandwell Park Golf Club near Birmingham approved a local rule allowing the use of steel shafted golf clubs in all competitions, believed to be the first golf club in Britain to do so. This was a decision possibly influenced by the fact that Walter Hackett, managing director of Accles and Pollock, was a member of the club. Other clubs began to do likewise, and this list from Golf Illustrated, November 1929, shows some of those. There was clearly growing pressure on the Royal and Ancient to do something, and on the 26th of November 1929, the R&A legalised the use of steel shafts for golf, partly basing its decision on an assurance from the USGA that steel shafts would not alter play in the same way that the adoption of the Haskell ball had done in the early 1900s, leading to the extending of golf courses. Shortly after this legislation, Accles and Pollock entered an agreement with True Temper to manufacture step-down shafts under the True Temper name for the European market, but they also continued to produce their own Apollo range. Over the next 5 or 6 years, hickory shafts were slowly superseded by steel, and even staunch hickory advocates such as Henry Cotton and Joyce Weatherhead began to use steel shafts. Henry Cotton wrote this pamphlet, I believe in 1932 or 33, titled Hints on Play with Steel Shafts. A couple of interesting points from the foreword. The steel shaft offers far less wind resistance than the old type of hickory shaft, and therefore it is much easier to swing. You can also take for granted that it makes golf easier. And related to the change from piecemeal acquisition of clubs to buying a set is this. I recommend players anxious to improve their game not only to follow my example and change to steel shafts, but to see to it that every club in their bag matches every other one. In other words, to play not with a collection of clubs, but with a set. And so the steel shaft had arrived, and hickory was quickly disappearing from the sales catalogues of manufacturers. Here we see the 1930 catalogue for Gibson, and on page 5 it reads, Gibsons are producing steel-shafted clubs with much variety and with the same efficiency as they have hitherto in hickory. And here we can see iron clubs on offer. On the left are heads only, and the great number of different models on offer is impressive. On the right we can see prices for completed clubs. It's interesting to note the difference between hickory and steel. For instance, James Braid's autograph clubs are 10 shillings with Style A hickory shafts. There are 4 steel shafted options, 12 shillings with British coppered, 12 shillings and 8pence with British gun barrel, 13 shillings with British imitation hickory, and 14 shillings with True Temper black shafts. Hickory continued to be used by both amateurs and professionals with some high-profile wins right into the mid-1930s, but the first big win for steel came at the US Open in 1931, where Billy Burke was the winner using steel shafts, and in 1933 at the Open most players were using steel shafted clubs. A very interesting comment was made in an interview some years later, whereby John Ovenstone, a former managing director of George Nickel, explained that, with the exception of special commissions, Nickel had stopped producing hickory shafted irons in 1932. It will be worthwhile now having a look at the different types of shaft coatings. A raw steel shaft will rust very quickly, and so they've always had some form of coating or other onto the top of the shaft. So let's have a look at the different types that were commonly used. First off, we'll look at Pyrotone, the one that most people associate with this era, but in the UK at least, its use seems to have been limited to the first few years of steel shaft production. It takes the form of a cellulose sheath over the shaft. It can be difficult to restore if water has got under the surface, and it tends to peel away in flakes. Next we have enamel paint, by far the commonest material that you're likely to find, and from a restoration point of view it's also the easiest to work with. Then we have chrome. Chrome didn't really feature very much in the early years of steel shafts. Whether this was due to the cost, a distaste on the part of the buyer, or a lack of a reliable plating process, I don't know. But many of the early chrome plated shafts I've seen seem to suffer from serious chrome loss. And finally we have lacquer. I'm not sure if this is actually lacquer, but it's a grey to green metallic finish and was popular pre and immediate post Second World War, more often seen on woods and putters in the UK than on irons. Now let's have a look why we should consider collecting early steel shafted clubs. I'm going to start with some negatives. Number 1, there was only a short period of production, effectively 10 years up until the outbreak of World War II, unless you go up to the start of the classic era of 1950, which gives us 20 years, but much of that second decade was lost to the Second World War. although this short production period can be seen as a good thing, as I'll explain when I come on to the positives. And now let's look at the positives. First off, cost. Prices are very low and single clubs can be picked up for a song. Complete sets are harder to find, irons more so than woods, and matching sets of woods and irons are very few and far between, but prices can still be very affordable. Then we have innovation. Innovation has always been a part of golf club manufacture, but at the time that steel shafts were being introduced, there was a host of new developments coming through, particularly where irons are concerned. The development of woods was limited to a gradual change of head shape and the more frequent use of face inserts as the late 1940s approached. Putter designs have always been at the whim of anybody who cares to come up with a new idea or theory, and the steel shaft era is no different in that respect. Now coming on to that short period of manufacture, this gives us a narrow field, and by choosing to collect steel shafted clubs made between the wars, we can focus attention on roughly 10 or 20 years of production and build up a good representative collection. A quick word on the rise of the finished club as well. Towards the end of the hickory era, a few companies had started to offer completed iron sets for sale. Nichol's Recorder, for instance, whereas prior to that there were forging houses who supplied club professionals with heads to be finished for sale by the professional. This was a relatively simple thing for a club professional to do, and is part of the charm of collecting hickory clubs. A hickory shaft is easy to work on and tailor to the needs of the customer by shaving off wood to alter the flex or cutting the length. Steel shafts, however, are much less workable. The only thing a club builder can do is alter the total length of the shaft or tip the shaft to give a different flex. And I'm not sure how well shaft tipping was understood back then, if at all. This lack of adjustability might be one of the reasons for the switch from club professionals assembling clubs to them buying finished clubs from the manufacturer. Whatever the reason, the change meant that manufacturers had more of an interest in the final product than before, as now their name and reputation were wholly visible in how the club performed. This led to them seeking to distinguish their clubs more, and we start to see an increase in the use of model names. This had already begun in the hickory era, but now accelerated. This potentially makes dating and identifying clubs a little easier for the collector, but access to the means to do so isn't easy. There are a few period catalogues around, and adverts in old magazines are an excellent resource, but again these magazines aren't easy to find. Well, I've chatted away for long enough now, and it's time to show you some clubs, which is what I really want to do. I think we'll start with some woods, then move on to the irons, and then have a look at some putters and try and pick the characteristics of clubs and what was going on during this exciting time in club development. The first wood is this J.H. Taylor Cynosure or Flywheel brand club. A straight move from hickory. We saw these in the hickory era, and this is just an identical head. See the banded crown and the brass sole plate. I've also shown an iron, and it's interesting to note the difference in shaft thicknesses. The wood shaft is considerably thinner, as whippy shafts for woods were quite popular at that time. Next up we have a Sibson Autograph club. Again, it's a typical hickory looking club. This one has a chrome shaft. Well, it has very poor adhesion, although there are examples with much worse chrome adhesion where all the chrome has pretty much disappeared and you just have the bare steel shaft. Our third wood is actually a set of 3, and these again could just as easily be hickory shafted. A horn slip plate on the driver, plain wood faces, and they show how the transition from hickory to metal shafts was a simple switch. In fact, steel shafts in woods gained acceptance much more quickly than in irons, where there was a perceived harshness of feel. These woods are also interesting in they show numbers. Numbers were already being accepted in irons, and now they were gradually creeping into woods. So the 1 is the driver, the 2 is the brassy, and the 3 is the spoon. Then we have the Forgan par shot, and this is one of a set of 4. part of a full set of clubs including irons and a putter, similar to the Octoloni woods, but by now the bone slip plate in the driver has been replaced by an aluminium sole plate. Then we have this one, a Colossus. I'm still not sure exactly who made this one. It's a 3-wood and it's unusual in having a concave sole. No surprise that this didn't catch on. And next we have 2 clubs by Gradage. The first is a Persimmon 3-wood, probably pre-war. And then we have a Bobby Lock laminate, which I'm sure would have come after the Second World War. And this is a 2-wood. Laminates have been around for longer than most people imagine. This example by Gradage would date to the 1950s, but I think that they first appeared in the 1930s. This one also has a lacquer shaft on the Bobby Lock wood. And finally, we have this one, Peak High, a patented head with a concave crown. And this is also what's often described as a fancy face wood. These were much more common in America, but some British examples can be found. I've been told that the pins on this might have been made using old knitting needles. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But often coloured pieces of wood, wood dowels, were used on the American models. So that concludes the woods, and now we move on to the irons. Our first iron example is this BJ Mashi with an unusual top line with an extended punch dot area. Head material had been evolving to stainless steel for some years and was already the most common material in hickory irons by the end of the 1920s. So it's no surprise that almost without exception, steel shafted clubs have stainless steel heads. But some raw steel examples are to be found, as per this example. And this brings me on to another subject, and that is ferrules, a particular weakness of mine. The earliest examples of steel shafts don't appear to have ferrules, but rather the neck of the hosel tapers narrowly down almost to the diameter of the shaft, as can be seen in this example. What caused the change to thicker hosels I'm not sure. Maybe the thinner walls cracked under stress, or it was just an easier manufacturing process. In any event, thicker-ended hosels began to be used, and so the ferrule made its appearance to smooth the flow from the end of the hosel down to the shaft. Here we have a driving iron from the St Andrew Golf Company. Again, no ferrule, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was a hickory version of this exact head. It's a pyrotone shafted club, and note the thin sole, a true butter knife if ever there was one. Next, the stroke balanced and power control irons. Early attempts at weight distribution, which had begun during the hickory era, had all been about concentrating the weight behind the ball for maximum power, as epitomised by this patented perfect balance model. These 2 examples continue that line of thought. As time went on, however, it was understood that concentrating the weight behind the ball was great if you middled it, but more difficult if you were hitting your shots off-centre, as these shots fell shorter. During the early steel shaft era, we see the beginnings of a move towards perimeter weighting, as we'll see soon, and this makes clubs much more forgiving. Now the Archie Thompson, another example without a ferrule and a head straight out of the hickory era. Note the shaft finish made to resemble wood. This is pyrotone again, and the particularly long hosel. This significant club is a St Andrew Golf Company augmented 5-iron. The augmented style was patented by Wilson in 1933, and it marks the beginnings of perimeter weighting. Before this, as we've seen, practically all weighting had tended towards putting the weight behind the ball, which is great on a centred strike, but not so good on a miss-hit. In 1933, the augmented club was patented. It was developed by Scotsman Willie Ogg with assistance from Dr. Lorenz Storz. Wilson began selling the clubs immediately in America. St Andrew Golf Company had a partnership with Wilson, and many of their clubs are exact copies of Wilson models, even down to sporting Wilson twin flag motif. This club is unusual for a British club in that it's a carbon steel head with chrome plating, which was much more common in America, which makes me wonder if it was supplied by Wilson already stamped up for sale by the St Andrew Golf Company. It also mentions the shaft on the back of the club, high power, and has one of the seamless ferrules rather than a separate ferrule where the shaft coating expands to meet the hosel. Now we have clubs by the George Nickel Company featuring their patented no-shock hosel. These are the accuracy model, a very unusual looking club, almost with an Art Deco style. And while we saw on the previous club that weight was moved towards the toe to position the centre of the club further away from the hosel, this model seems to follow the exact opposite and move weight towards the hosel. Not sure what the thinking was behind that. But coming back to the fault directed at steel shafts of a jarring feel, a number of companies brought out clubs designed to combat this accusation, whether it was real or not. Spalding's cushion neck was one, and George Nickel brought out the no-shock hosel, featuring an adapter piece that slipped over the shaft and inside the hosel, as can be seen here. There was for a long time a theory that the no-shock hosel was developed to allow both hickory and steel shafts to be fitted with the same club. But some research by Ian Forrester has pretty much proven that the no-shock hosel was only ever used on steel shafts and was never intended to have a hickory shaft fitted, although there have been many conversions to hickory shafts over the years. Now we have a Gibson 5-iron, the Lodestar model. Gibson were always a big innovator in club design, and this is the earliest true perimeter weighted club that I've found. It's subtle, but there's definitely a raised perimeter to the club. I've tried to show this in the pictures, but I'm not sure whether I've succeeded or not. Now we come on to a patent shaft. I haven't come across many examples of these. I recently saw one with a sort of a barley twist to about a 2-inch section of it, but this one is pretty much unique, and I've never seen another one like it. Well, I'm sure that the theory was well thought out. To me, it just appears to create a series of weak spots, and I don't even hit this one. It's got a series of crimps at 90 degrees to each other, and they, I presume, were designed to create a different flex on the shaft, or maybe strengthen it even. There are also several variations on grooved or fluted shafts. Hexagonal shafts were also used, and I'll show an example of that shortly. Sometimes it's just a combination of great names on a club that make it appealing. Here we have Spalding, Stewart and Henry Cotton in combination to make a very attractive club. Henry Cotton was of course better known for his long association with George Nickel, but before that he partnered with Spalding. And here we have the four clubs really, illustrating the longevity of a particular style, and that is the DW brand. This first appeared in the hickory era, and it's a perfect example of a timeless design that showed its worth over the coming decades. And the design can still be found in many golf clubs even today. Now we have the OW model, another one from St Andrew Golf Company, and it's another example of the augmented style of iron. I assume that the OW stands for Og Willie. Was this one produced without help from Wilson? I spoke earlier about how some clubs have a ferrule as part of the shaft, and sometimes the shaft coating expands to greet the hosel, and this is another example of that. The coating thickens near the hosel to smooth out the line. And it's also a club with a hexagonal shaft towards the grip end of the club. Again, I hope I've shown that in the photograph. Now we have a gradage club, and this is a good example of weighting to the centre of the club. I was very pleased to find this set in such good condition. Note the workmanship in the leather grits. The size of the heads are also quite large, particularly the irons at the bottom of the set, and it's another set with extremely thin soles. I showed the woods from the Forgan set in the wood section, and here are the irons to go with them. This is a fine set of irons, and I'm sure that they were all sold together, woods, irons and putter, even though two of the clubs are chrome shafted rather than painted. The shaft labels are identical, which backs up this theory. Here we have the wonderfully named pin cracker, clearly a part of the pin pointer and pin splitter family of George nickel irons. Interestingly, it has a drill-through hosel, first patented by Thomas Carruthers in 1891. This set was made for export to Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. Now a ladies set, peak high irons, but these are so pure in their muscle-back design. How I wish that they were a man's set, and one day I'll play them even though they're short and have a lady's shaft. And finally, to end the iron section, we have these John Letters Coney Ridge irons. An unusual sole design. I'm pretty sure that the design was pre-war, but they were being offered again post-war as industry gradually recovered. The paint fill is almost certainly a later edition, as I'm pretty sure that it wasn't used at this time. That concludes the irons, so now let's take a look at some putters. I've chosen a small number of putters to look at, and to start with, this unusual It Sits model, similar to the Varden Brown putter which appeared in the hickory era, but it has a more pyramid shaped crown and the face is very low, as you can see when it's compared against this 1.62 inch ball. I'm not sure who made it, but it looks like a Jack White cleat mark on the sole. Next up we have a Spalding W model, and again I've seen a hickory version of this one. It has a long head with a lovely balance and it's one of my favourite putters to play with. Next up, the Stag St Andrews Golf Company Jupiter model. This is quite a lofted putter, so ideal for those slower winter greens when there's a bit of growth on them. Then we have a Joyce Weathered putter. I think that this might be by the American company Wanamaker and produced on the back of Joyce Weathered's tour of America. Next we have another four-gun club, and this one the famous cash-in putter. This was produced under license from Spalding, and it also has another example of the grey-green metallic lacquer finish shaft. Then we have another long-running model, the four-gun Black Magic putter. This has a head made from vulcanite, which I think is rubber treated with sulphur. It began in the hickory era and it appeared in several guises into the steel shafted age. Next we have a Castle Les Gowers by the Castle Equipment Company of London. This is a very short aluminium head with internal weighting. Not an easy club to use in my experience. Then we have one of the most famous British putters, the John Letters Golden Goose. This was developed by the John Letters Company in 1946, before the American Bullseye putter. And this is an early version, as you can tell by the coated steel shaft. And finally we have a Gradage putter. And this is just a very elegant putter. There's no other reason that it's in there. I just really like the look of it. Well, that concludes this video. I hope I've piqued your interest in collecting this neglected era and it begins to gain more traction. If you've got any comments or questions, please put them below in the comments section. Well, thanks for watching and I hope to see you next time. Bye.